Test. Okay. Well, welcome to week 5 of this week that we dive into the next section of our study. But before we start, I'd like to pray. So, dear God, I just thank you, Lord, for this time. I thank you that we get to have a chance to dive into your word and to study it and to understand the deep things that you want to teach us today, God. I ask that you would give me the words to speak. They would be your words and not mine, and clarity of thought. In Jesus' name, amen. So we had just finished up the law, which was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And now we're moving on to our history books, which is Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And I'm going to take the prophets and put them into this history timeline so that it makes more sense and you can understand, well, why did Hosea say this, or where did Isaiah come in, and you can understand what was going on at the time, that they would speak what they were speaking to and who they were speaking to. So that's my goal when we get there. But we're going to start with Joshua today. So Joshua is our first book of history. It was written by Joshua. It is when Joshua led the people into rest of the promised land. So they had gone with Moses. They were rebellious toward the Lord. The Lord said, I'm going to punish you for 40 years in the desert. And then Joshua, when Moses has died, Joshua is now taking his place, and he comes through and he brings them finally to the fulfillment of the promise. So what's interesting about Joshua is that he has the same name as Jesus. So Joshua is the Hebrew word, and Jesus is the Greek. So it's the same name, but a bit different languages that we would speak. So with the history books, this is laying the foundation of to why it's building on. So we have the law, we understand why Jesus had to come, but then we see what man has done that has the Lord come in the timing that he does. And I want to show that to you as we continue on. So Joshua, his original name was Hoshea, which means salvation. And then Moses changed it to Joshua, which means Yahweh is salvation, in Numbers 13:16. So Joshua meets this commander of the Lord. And Pastor Drell spoke about it a little bit on Sunday. And, he comes and he sees this, says, this angel man that he doesn't know what's going on. And he goes up and he says, who are you for? Is it you for me or my enemies? And this being says, no, I am here as the commander of the Lord. And so he wanted to show that he was there to be in charge. And that when he asked for Joshua to take off his shoes because it's holy ground, you would do that with the Lord. And so that's why we have a really strong interpretation that person was Jesus, to say this land is holy, take off your shoes because you're in my presence, versus just an angel delivering a message. So Joshua, he was one of the original spies that had gone into the land and came back and said, we can do it. But the people decided to side with the 10 that said, no, there's too many giants. But he finally has a chance to come back around the second time, and he's like, this time, we're going to do it. And so he was very faith motivated into knowing that God will do what he said he would do. And so first they come to the first city of Jericho, and they send in some spies to scout it out, and they come across Rahab. And Rahab was not a Jew. She was one of the ones that lived in the city, and she said, listen, we already know that you are going to defeat us. It's already been talked about that this God of the Israelites are coming. So, I'll hide you, but please save my family. And so the spies made a promise with her that if she would hold out a scarlet cord out of her window, that whoever was in her home would be safe. So she did that. And her obedient act resulted in her being in the genealogy of Jesus. And I'll get back to how she fits in with that in a little bit, but I want to put that little bug in your ear with Rahab as an important figure in Jesus' line. So the biggest army of nationality that the Jews had to encounter were the Amorites. The Amorites were giants. They were the ones that when the Jews went first into the promised land and saw these giants, that was them. So an average Hebrew in an Egyptian were about 5 foot to 5.5 feet. That was the average height of a man. But the Amorites were 6 foot, so they were a half foot taller. So the height, that's one aspect that they were superior in that way. They had advanced weapons. So they were the first people to introduce having a horse attached to a chariot. They actually defeated parts of Egypt way before the Israelites were delivered from Egypt. This was way back. They had come and taken over a lot of Egypt because the Egyptians had donkeys. They used donkeys with the chariots, and here comes the Amorites with horses, and they just blew them out of the water. And so Egypt sees this and then takes on that form. So then that's why you see later on when it said that Pharaoh and all of his horses and chariots and all went after Israel. They had horses at that time to be able to stand up as being a strong leader of that in that day. But it was the Amorites that started off with that. They also were superior with their weapons. So they had this bow that was called a laminated bow, and it had more velocity and distance than all the other bow and arrows. So their bow was able to go farther, and so they didn't have to get as close. So when you have your armies where you set everyone up, you have your footmen, you have your horsemen, and you go into battle, and then you have the ones that are the archers, the bow and arrows. Well, their advantage is that if they can kill as many before the footmen and the horsemen get there, then you conquered part of the war. So they would stand back and try to get as many arrows in the air to come at the enemy and to kill as many people as possible. But you had to get close enough to be able to reach there. But if you had a laminated bow, you could be really far back and shoot those arrows, and the enemy doesn't even see you. They won't even know that the arrows are coming until they get hit. So they're not even getting prepared because they see you right over there shooting at them. It's like they're so far back that when they shoot these arrows, they aren't prepared, and so they're able to be defeated. So they had this laminated bow. So with the weapons, with having the superior horses and chariots, with being so much taller, they were able to defeat tons of nations around them. So they were the giants. They were the warriors that Israel said, there's no way. If they came and defeated Egypt, how are we going to defeat them? Because Egypt was able to enslave us. And they didn't have those weapons. Israel didn't have these chariots and these warrior, laminated bows. They didn't have those things. All they had was God. And so it had to take a lot of faith in the natural to say that our God is bigger than the technology and the superiority of the warriors of the day. So the Amorites were huge. So what Joshua did is he said, what can be against God? And so he decided to say, no, we're going to go in, we're going to defeat the enemy. And so after Jericho, they went from place to place. So most of the area they had the Hittites, Jebusites, but they were all ruled by the Amorites. The Amorites were like the top dogs. And so they went from city to city and conquered military victories because of the Lord being on their side. So they finally come to this one point in Joshua 11 that was of the capital, Hazor. And that was the capital of the Amorites. And in those days, if you could defeat the capital, you won the war. So that's why when he had the enemy come in different areas on Israel, when they couldn't conquer Jerusalem, they fell back. It's like that was their capital. We couldn't defeat them, so we lost the war. Even though they could have conquered all the area around it, they couldn't get Jerusalem, then they didn't win. So Hazor was the capital of the Amorites. And what was important with Hazor was that Joshua comes in and he takes it on. And this city was 3 times the size of any city around it. So it was huge. And even at this point, it said that the Amorite king was afraid of Joshua. He saw all the things that he was doing with all the areas around him. So he got all these other kings to help support him. And now here they come out with advanced weapons, with advanced military against Joshua, who didn't have those things, and Joshua still won. And so it just shows, that's why the Lord said, didn't I do this? Didn't I do this? Like, how can you still doubt me when I let all of these people that you thought you were grasshoppers in their eyes, and I was able to help win the victory with the Lord. So they conquered Hazor. And then I wanted to go into this because the Lord tells the Israelites, it says, now Joshua, so he had did a lot more victories, and you can read about them and go into them, but the main thing I want to get to is more of the background. So I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of the things that he did. But when Joshua was an old man, the Lord said, you're growing old, and there's much land that remains to be conquered. I myself will drive out these people out of the land ahead of the Israelites. And so he said, be sure to give the land as a special possession, just as I commanded you. Okay, so he promises that there is still land that needs to be conquered because it was a massive amount of territory that they were giving the 12 tribes of Israel. But he said, you haven't done it yet, but I will drive them out myself. Okay, so to get you that context. Then later, it said in Joshua 24, I think I have that in the Bible. God makes a covenant again, Joshua 24, with the Israelites. And he says, it's set up exactly like Deuteronomy. So we said with Deuteronomy, it was a contract, it was a covenant that God did with the Jews by saying, if you do these things, I will be with you. I will have, these things will happen. If you don't do this, then these things will come about. So in Joshua 24, he has another contract that he makes with the Lord and the Jews, and he has witnesses, and he has things, a backstory about what the Lord did all the way up to that point. And then he said to them, God is a holy God, and he is a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins if you forsake the Lord and serve other gods. He will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. But the people said, no, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord. And they said, yes, we are witnesses. So he makes a covenant with them, and he writes it down. It says in the book of the law of the Lord, and he took a large stone and set it up under the oak near the holy place of the Lord and said, see, this is a reminder of the covenant that you have made. So the Lord said, I will drive out the people, makes a covenant with his people saying, if you obey me, I will do the things that I have promised. And then we turn where it says in Judges 1, the tribe of Zebulun failed to drive out the residents. The tribe of Asher failed out to drive out the residents. The tribe of Naphtali failed to drive out the residents. And Manasseh failed to drive out the residents, okay? So they were not able to drive out everyone else. Why? Well, in Judges 2, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal and said to the Israelites, I brought you out of Egypt into this land that I swore to give your ancestors, and I said I would never break my covenant with you. For your part, you are not to make any covenants with the people living in this land. Instead, you are to destroy their altars, but you disobeyed my command. Why did you do this? So now I declare that I will no longer drive out the people living in your land. They will be a thorn in your side, and their gods will be a constant temptation for you. So he promised, I will do this. And then he made a covenant and said, please obey me, and I will come through as I did all the other times with the Amorites, and I destroyed them. And then the people said, yes, we will. We promise. We make this covenant. We're witnesses. Here's a stone to show that we are now witnesses. And then they disobey the Lord. They don't follow him. They accept the gods of the other countries. And God said, okay, I'm not going to let you drive them out. And they couldn't do it on their own. And so that's where we would end up in the beginning of Judges. But before we get there, I wanted to go to Ruth, because near the beginning of Judges is the book of Ruth, and so I wanted to give you that story before we head into the chaos of Judges. So the author of Ruth is unknown. We think it's Samuel, but we're not exactly sure. It is a history book. The main point is that there's a kinsman redeemer. So Boaz in the story is the kinsman redeemer. He's a type of Christ who redeemed us. So we have Naomi, who was a Jew, and she was in the land of Moab. And so she had her two sons marry two daughters that were Moabites. One was married to Ruth, the other one was married to Orpah. And so they were sisters. and they were able to, everything was great. They lived with Naomi, and then her sons and her husband died. And she decides, I'm all by myself, I'm going to go back to Israel. And so she tells them, go back home, start your own lives. You're widows, you can have this fresh life. You're not even Jewish, you don't need to come with me. And so it says Orpah's all upset, yes, I'll miss you. And then she leaves and she goes home. But it said that Ruth clung to her and said, no, where you go, I will go, and your people will be my people. So with Naomi, you have her line. This is where Rahab comes back into play. Rahab is Boaz's mother. Boaz is a very wealthy man in that area, and so she had come back, married a Jew, and had a son, Boaz. They have all of this land. They're very wealthy, and here comes Ruth, who's a poor widow, and the Israelites are told by the Lord to take care of the poor, to throw down extra grain, so that when they come to gather, after you've gathered, throw extra grain on the ground so that the poor can come among you and make sure that they have food. So that's what she was doing. She went up and she gathered the grain, came home to Naomi. But then when Boaz saw her, he thought, who is this young lady? And he likes her. He thinks that, she's pretty. And so he tells his servants, throw extra down. So they throw extra down, and here comes Ruth back home. And Naomi's thinking, where did you get all this grain? And she's like, oh, it's from Boaz. And so then Ruth comes up with this plan. Oh, Boaz. And she knows he likes her. So she says, why don't you go and you lay at his feet? And it's pretty much to ask to be his wife, because women weren't allowed to do that. So this was like a back-end approach to say, I'm interested in being your wife. Will you choose me? And so Boaz, he does. He says yes. He accepts the offer. But there's a problem, is that Ruth has to be redeemed. So it's called a kinsman redeemer. And what it is if a person or land is sold into bondage, they have to be bought back. So she was sold into bondage because there was debt that was from her line. So we had Naomi's husband had debt, Elimelech, and so she was part of that because she stayed within the family of Naomi, and so all the debt had to be paid, and she had to be married, included in that debt, okay, in order for the person to marry her. So the main things with a kinsman redeemer is that, one, it has to be a close relative. So the person that is the next closest relative has the option of being that kinsman redeemer. He has to marry Ruth. He has to pay off her debt. Secondly, you had to pay the full price of the redemption. So you couldn't just say, I'll just marry her but not pay the debt. You had to pay it all. And you had to be willing to pay the price that was owed. And then you had the person that was going to be the kinsman redeemer had to be free themselves. They couldn't have debt anywhere else. So they had to be out of debt. They had to be completely self-sustaining. So that was Boaz. Well, there was someone before him, and he found out, and so he went and asked that individual, will you marry Ruth? And because I want to, but you're the next in line. And the guy said, no, I'm not interested. And so then Boaz says, okay, I'll take it on. So then he was able to be her kinsman redeemer. They get married, and they have a son. So we have now Ruth plus Boaz, have a son Obed, who has a son Jesse, who has a son David. Jesus is from David's line. Rahab to Boaz to Obed to Jesse to David, down to Jesus. And that's how she is in that line. So John uses the symbolism of a kinsman redeemer in Revelation, where Jesus is reclaiming his property as he opens the seals to the title deed of the earth at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation period. It talks about the seals. He opens up one of the seals, and he says, I am reclaiming the property that there's debt. I am paying it off so that I own it, and he is our kinsman redeemer, because we had given that authority and that right over to Satan at the garden. And then Jesus comes and demands to have it back because he died on the cross. So Boaz is also a type of Christ. He marries Ruth, who's Gentile. And so when you think about, what does Jesus do? He married a Gentile bride. It wasn't pure Jewish. He also brought in the nations, and you are grafted in. So when Ephesians 5:31-32, and it talks about that whole thing of the uniting the church with Christ, he said, a man will leave his father and unites with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. But I am talking about Christ and the church. So there is more than just this relationship that you have with Christ. It is a union comparing it to like a marriage that you would have with Jesus to become one with him as his body in the church. Okay, so we're now going into Judges. So with Judges, this is a time of pure chaos. It's really bad. And so the author of Judges, we are again uncertain. We think that Samuel could have written portions and others have added to it. But the main thing that it repeats over and over again is that the people did what were right in their own eyes. And it is leading into Samuel, which comes after, and the kingship of the monarchy, the United Monarchy that develops from that. And so there has been a lot of times that people will take the book of Judges and misinterpret it, and they'll say, well, during the time of Judges, there was no king because God was their king. And they'll say, well, that's a good thing. It was actually really bad when Saul came along, because then it was like they rejected God and then they chose Saul, and because of that one thing that you hear about Samuel saying, and the Lord responds to him. So I'm going to go into that, but I want to tell you that is not the case. With Judges, it is not that God was their king, and I will show you why that is not true. So we have these cycles of judgment and rescue that the Lord has done. So you have the people where they are sinning, they cry out. So they're not truly repentant. They just cry out, help us, deliver us, Lord. The Lord has compassion on them. He sends someone to deliver them. They have a time of prosperity because of their deliverer, and then they go back into sin. And it just repeats again and again. So it was a time of lawlessness. And this also mirrors in 2 Timothy 3, it talks about the future tribulation period being a time of lawlessness, like in the book of Judges, where it's at its peak, where just everyone does what was right in their own eyes. There is no real concrete right and wrong. It's just whatever is fit for you, you do, and then for me is different. And you can see where everything has been going at this day and age. There's 350 years of the reign of the judges. A judge was a leader that was raised up by God to deliver the people from oppression. They weren't unified. It wasn't that there was this country of Israel, and here comes this leader to save the day, and they all submit to this leader and say, hallelujah, he's come and deliver us, and they're unified. It was very tribal. Tribalism was rampant. It was like, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, and if you're a Levite, you're like my enemy. I'm looking for my own leader. I'm doing what I think is right. And so you're different, you're not, they weren't all unified as, we're all the nation of God, of Israel. It was very much tribalism. And because of that, it was very poor. There was areas of people that were not being received, like the Lord said, like, during Boaz's day about throwing the wheat on the ground. That was not happening very often because they did what was right in their own eyes, and they thought, I'm not going to do that. That's not right to me. I'm going to keep what I sow. It is not the original name in the book for Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible. The word judge as a title actually never appears in the book. It says it in English translation because it was translated to the Greek whenever they had the New Testament. They wanted to have the Gentiles read the Old Testament, so they changed the whole Old Testament into Greek, and they called it the Septuagint. And they gave it so that now everyone can read it because everyone spoke Greek. But the original form, the name wasn't judge. There was no judge. It was just a leader. So if you ever see, like in your study Bibles, if it says something like a judge was raised up, it'll have a little asterisk, and you go down, it says, or leader, because that's what it originally said. There was no title judge in the entire book. So what the book's name was so Jews, what they do when they have a book and they want to name it, they'll take the first 3 or 4 words of that book, and that's what the name is. So the book really is after the death of Joshua, because verse 1, it says, after the death of Joshua, this was happening. So that was the name of the book. That's what it is in their Bible, after the death of Joshua. So Moses trained up Joshua as the next leader. It said the spirit of Moses went on Joshua, And it talks about, Joshua following the book of law like Moses did. But then when he died, there was no one that was trained up. And so text doesn't really say why. But if you look at the people's actions, they hated Moses. They loved him later. They honored what he did. They thought he was this amazing, mighty man. But in his lifetime, all they did was complain and whine and say, God, did you really choose him? How do we know you really chose him? And they grumbled all the time against Moses. So he wasn't very popular. So they hated Moses. Then here comes Joshua, and they do the same thing to him. They start complaining and whining and saying, who made you leader again? And they began, so that's why by the time you get to Judges, everyone's like, we're just going to do what we think is right in our own eyes. So we feel like that the Lord, because he raised up, and the people keep rebelling, so he says, okay, you want to not have a leader? You figure it out, and let's see how that goes for you. And so he allows them to do what they want, just like he does with the sin cycle where everyone goes into sin and God says, okay, my hands of protection are now off, and then they get in bondage. That's what happens, and it's to show them, because you can see later on, it's brought up in the New Testament about the time of the judges, showing Israel, showing the people, you need God. You need God. You cannot live this life and do it on your own. You cannot do what you think is right and everything goes okay. It will always end in tragedy. You need the Lord as your guiding protector and king. The verb judge is used, but not the title judge, which is shafet in Hebrew. It's not mentioned in the book. So there wasn't a consistent office of judge. Each person that was a leader of their tribe. So there were 12 judges, just like there's a lot of 12s. There's 12 minor prophets, there's 12 disciples, there's 12 tribes. So there were 12 judges, but each judge was not the judge or the leader of Israel. It was like the leader of this tribe or the leader of this tribe that the Lord brought up, and they were able to deliver their tribe from tragedy. So Israel was being ruled by tribal leaders, and that's how they were able to look at the leader that was up and coming as a person to follow. Okay, so theocracy. Means ruled by God. God is king. Now, God is king. He is king today. He was king back then. That did not change his title or who he was. But their acknowledgement of being ruled by God was not there. So that's where I want to point out, is that God was their king, but they didn't recognize him as their king, and that's why they did what was right in their own eyes. So why do we sometimes call the Judges, the book of Judges, as a theocracy? I've heard people say this, that this is a time before where God was able to be their king, and that there was no earthly king for them to follow because the Lord was. And what it comes back to is that there was a writer called Josephus who wrote books of history about the Jews. And when it came to the account of the Judges, he said in his description of commentary, he said that this was an ideal time. He said that all the troubles that man has was because of bad kings and bad rulers. So the lack of kingship was great. It was an opportunity for the Lord to come in and be their king. And so this was a great time. And then later on, the monarchy came with Saul and destroyed it. And that's why they had all these issues and all these problems. And a lot of time, too, when our country was founded, they looked at that as well. And they said, well, the time of the judges, God was their king. And so they were able to bring up leaders that they followed that helped deliver them. And so we should bring up leaders as well that we should agree on and follow and not have a kingship, because the kingship is bad. England and what they did, it was bad, so we're going to nix the kingship. But I think that we've gone too far to say that, because God is king. And so whenever we look at the kingship as being bad instead of the people making decisions that are bad, then we miss the point. So in Judges, the word Torah, the law, is not mentioned one time. The word prophet is mentioned one time in chapter 6, verse 8. Prophetess is mentioned one time in chapter 4, verse 4. There is one priest in this whole book, but he's corrupt. The tabernacle is not mentioned. A feast or a holy day of the Lord is not mentioned. The Ark of the Covenant, not one time. Grace, God's grace of hesed, hen is the words that are used for God's grace in Hebrew. It was mentioned once. So if you look at that and say all the important things of the law that the Lord said, do this, follow this, observe these practices, remember me, make these sacrifices, and then it's not mentioned, God was not their king. So there are 12 judges. The first one was Othniel, and he brought 40 years of peace to Israel after he delivered the nation from the oppressive Mesopotamia king Cushan. And then came Ehud, who brought 80 years of peace to Israel after he killed the Moabite king Eglon. And then Shamgar, he killed 600 Philistine warriors. Deborah, she was the only female judge. She brought 40 years of peace after she fought the Canaanite king Jabin and General Sisera. Gideon, he brought 40 years of peace after he delivered them from Midianite oppression with 300 men. So that was the Gideon where he came and said, he was walking around the winepress, and the angel said, "Oh, mighty warrior." And he looks and says, "You're talking to me? I'm the least of my tribe. I'm the least of my clan. I'm the least of my family. I am not a mighty warrior." And the angel says, "Yes, you are. The Lord has chosen you." And so he goes against this huge army of Midian, who's countless numbers, and the Lord says, "I'm going to do it." So he knocks down the numbers of the Israelites again and again until it's 300 men. They go out to war with no weapons, and then he said, "I want you to take this, a vase and have a torch, and at my command, I want you to throw the vase down on the ground and then yell as loud as you can." And so they surround the camp of the Midianites, and they do it in the middle of the night. And then it says the Midianites woke up, they see what's going on, they think they're being attacked by countless people, and so they start turning sword on each other, and they kill each other off, and here comes Israel, walks right in, defeated the day. So the Lord did that again and again and again throughout the judges' time, and Gideon was one of them. So then we go on. Number 6 is Tola. And Tola, there's not a lot of information given except he was the son of Puah, who lived in the hill country of Ephraim, and he reigned 23 years. Next one is Jair. Jair judged for 22 years, had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and ruled 30 cities. Jephthah ruled 6 years and brought 40 years of peace after delivering the people from the Ammonites. Isbin had 30 sons and 30 daughters, ruled for 7 years and brought peace for those 7 years. Elon judged for 10 years and brought 10 years of peace. Abdon ruled for 8 years, had 40 sons, 30 grandsons who rode 70 donkeys. Donkeys were very kingly at that time because no one could afford a horse unless you were of military strength. Like I told you, the Amorites had. Israel did not have that. So donkeys were the best thing. And then we come to Samson. So here's where I want to stop. Samson is judge number 12. He is a Nazirite. So if you remember, I talked a little bit about the Nazirites and what you had to do. So they could not cut hair. They could not eat grapes or drink wine. And they could not, don't eat. Touch a dead body or anything that was dead, that was living. Okay, so those are the 3 things. So he was a Nazirite before he was born. When his mother was conceived, it said an angel came and said, "Your son is to be a Nazirite. Do these things. Do not let these things happen like all of his life, and the Lord will be with him." So here comes Samson, and his special ability was that he had supernatural strength given miraculously by God due to being a Nazirite and the vow that he had given as serving the Lord. But the problem is that you can't force somebody to serve God. So God gave him this great opportunity of saying, "I am going to give you the ability to be a Superman for Israel, do things that no other country can do. They can only wish they had someone like this, more powerful than Goliath, way more powerful." And yet he had to just serve the Lord, and he didn't. He took it, he was very, very prideful, and I want to show you why. So we have the things that he did that he was not supposed to do. He started knocking them off the list. So he loved to party, so he would drink wine all the time. So that one, oh, you disobeyed that, Samson. Then it said that he came across, he was walking on the road, and there was a lion, and he tore the lion's mouth like if it was just a small goat. It wasn't a big deal to him, with his bare hands, and he threw it down on the ground. And then as he came back around later, he saw that this lion in the carcass of his mouth had a beehive with honey in it, and he went up, now it's dead, and he touched the honey to eat some, and he actually brought it back to his parents, gave it to him, didn't tell him that he had touched a dead body. Okay, he disobeyed that one. So by the time he gets to the hair, that's why he knows, if I cut my hair, I'm done. He knows he'd already disobeyed these two. So that's why when he gets to Delilah and she's like, tell me the secret to your strength, he knows it's his hair because he had already broken the other 2 points that he was not supposed to do. So in Judges 15, I want to bring this up to you. It says, so he gets married to a Philistine, and there's this point where, he is very prideful and he gets angry and he just leaves her and he just goes home. And he comes back later expecting his wife to be there, and he notices that she was given away to his best man at the wedding. And he gets mad, and he says, what's going on? And the father said, well, you left, so I didn't know if you were coming back, and I just gave her to somebody else to get married to. And so he retaliates, and he takes foxes, and he ties their tails together, lights them on fire, and releases them into this, field of wheat, and it destroys acreage of food. And the Philistines are like, what? Like, what happened? And they run and they find out, it's because Samson's wife was given away to another man. So they take the wife and the father and they kill him because they think, we're not going to have this. We can't get Samson upset. So they do that, and then Samson hears about it and gets mad. You killed my wife? That's it. I'm going to retaliate against you. And so then he says that he goes and he takes a donkey's jawbone, and he kills 1,000 men with just the jawbone. Now, they came with their swords and spears, and he just took a jawbone unarmed and killed them all. So you can see this back and forth. So then the Philistines are like, we don't know what to do. Like, how can we kill this man? We don't know how to do it. So after he's done, killing 1,000 men, it says, when he finished speaking, so he talks to them about, I have killed all these men with this jawbone, and look at me. And he said he threw away the jawbone, and because he was very thirsty, he cried to the Lord and said, you have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So he almost brings it back to the Lord like, I just killed all these men for you, God. Where's my water? So very, very prideful. And the Lord, it said he opened up a place and water came out of it. So Samson drank, his strength returned, and he was revived, and he went home. Okay? And then the next story is Delilah. So God has patience for so long. These were not, a lot of these judges, some of them were God-fearing, but there was many of them who were like Samson, that it was all about me, look what I did, and then God said, that's enough. So that's why they only reigned for like 5 years or 7 years. Like some of them it wasn't for a long period of time because God's patience was like, no. It's not you. It's me. And I'm doing it. I'm allowing you to have these victories. But when you think it's about you, that's when I pull back. So then with Delilah, he comes in, Delilah's, the Philistines are thinking, we have to figure out his strength because he just keeps making a mockery of us. Israel just has him, and he just wins every time, and so they find out it's his hair, and so they cut it, they take him away, and they're able to bring him up where, they tie him to kind of display him at this big event they have around a stadium. And so then he pushes the pillars down from the roof, and it falls down on them, and it actually kills more people in that stadium than his whole lifetime against the Philistines. So there was a lot of people there that had died that day. So Samson, he's dead, and the time goes on. And I want to tell you in Judges 17, I want to read this to you to show you the state of Israel at this time. Now a man named Micah from the hill country of Ephraim said to his mother, "The 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and about which I heard you utter a curse, I have that silver with me. I took it." His mother said, "The Lord bless you, my son." Then he returned with 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother and said, "I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord for my son to make an image overlaid with silver, and I will give it back to you." So this is what happened. This young man stole money from his mom. And she must have uttered some curse and just like, "Cursed is the man that took this money from me." Well, he feels bad, so he gives it back to her. And in thankfulness, she says, "Son, because you did such a great thing, I will make an idol from some of the money that you gave back to me." So after he returned the silver to his mother, she took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to a silversmith, who used them to make an idol, and it was put in Micah's house. So this young man's name is Micah. Now this man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and some household gods and installed one of his sons to be his priest. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. That's probably the 100th time that is mentioned in the book of Judges. To say again that everyone is not following the Lord because there is no king. They are not recognizing God as their king. They're not recognizing anybody as their king. They're doing what they seem fit in their own eyes. What did he think was fit? Let's make an idol, put on that ephod, which was meant for Aaron. So he had those gems of each of the tribes that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. He would wear it as he went into the Holy of Holies to talk to the Lord God on the Day of Atonement, to sprinkle the blood on the Ark of the Covenant. One time a year, he had to do that whole ceremony, make sure he's perfectly clean, wear the whole thing around his ankle, the rope in case he falls over dead, and they had to pull him out, all those things. And this man said, "I'm just going to be him, because I'm going to do what sees fit in my own eyes. I'm going to make this idol and a shrine around it, and I'm going to put it on because I'm now the priest, and I'm going to offer sacrifices in the name of the Lord." Okay? This is how bad Israel has gotten to be. They are not looking at the Lord as their king. So then a young Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, who had been living with the clan of Judah, left that town in search of some other place to stay. On his way, he came to Micah's house in the hill country of Ephraim. Micah asked him, "Where are you from?" "I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah," he said, "and I'm looking for a place to stay." Then Micah said to him, "Live with me and be my father and my priest, and I'll give you 10 shekels of silver a year, your clothes and your food. So I will give you a tithe. You will be my priest. We'll have this whole thing set up so that I'm doing what the Lord wants me to do, according to the book of the law." So the Levite agreed to live with him, and the young man became one of his sons to him. Then Micah installed the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in his house. And Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since this Levite has become my priest." That was their interpretation. So the whole country of Israel was taking a very gross approach to the holiness of the Lord, and they thought they were doing what was right in their own eyes. So that was Judges. So when it comes into the time of the monarchy being established, this is where they're coming from. They're coming from this misinterpretation of whole lawlessness that no one knows what they're doing. No one is being accountable to the Lord. And the Lord is saying, I've raised up all these people for you, and no one is turning your hearts back. Okay, so during this time, before we have Samuel, there was this big thing that happened called the Sea Peoples Movement. And if you ever wondered, how did Egypt have this really strong economy, really strong kingdom, and then it just dwindled down to nothing? Where you had, like Cleopatra was like the last one, they said, of the line and all these things, and it just was nothing. They were not strong. They became very powerless. But all the places did that because of this. Okay, so the Sea Peoples Movement was, for about a century, you have people that left their homeland and they traveled. And so when you have a kingdom that has all these people in your borders and you have it all secure, and then your people get up and leave, you don't have a kingdom. So you're weak. And so everyone was doing this. There was 100 years of this movement, and it totally collapsed the ancient world. All the great powers were gone. Egypt, even though they survived it, which I'll explain why, but they were never the same. So everything just started crumbling down. And so people have tried to figure out, well, what happened? Why did all these people just suddenly get up and start moving around? And they have found that there was a tremendous drought in this area of the ancient world. And there's evidence where it's like they found these tablets and these inscriptions where they had, like the Hittites were known for grain, and they actually had to get grain imported to them because they didn't have any. Well, if you're the major exporter of grain and you don't have grain, then that's a problem because, like that's going to cause a big disruption in your economy. So people were getting up and leaving because there was no food. And so they've looked and they've taken soil analysis and tree ring analysis. So they talk about, the tree rings and how, like, if they're thick, then that means that it was, really good. If it's, like, thin, then that means that there wasn't much growth and all of those things. And they found that there was something very big and disruptive, so they think it's because of this drought. So everyone started traveling to Egypt because in Egypt, it didn't depend on rain because the flood waters came and it was able to give the land its fertility to being able to plant. So they weren't affected by the drought, and so they had food, and so everyone came there. But then what does that cause? Pirating, lawlessness, all this crazy stuff that happens. And so it destroyed and weakened all the superpowers of this world. And what happened with Israel is that it gives this little country of Israel an opportunity to become great. Because whenever Saul and David and Solomon come up and have their kingdoms, now, in the natural now, like God, with the whole thing with the Amorites, he can destroy a huge superpower and have Israel be the king. But what had happened to set up the stage was because all these big, big countries of superpowers were weakened, they were able to shine. They were able to conquer areas. They were able to be strong compared to everyone else in the day. So you have the end of the Sea Peoples movement was 1150 BC. And 1050 BC is Saul. And then comes David, and then comes Solomon. And then after Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided, which we'll go into. And then you have Assyria, which awakens, and that's the big power. That's bigger than the Amorites. Syria was deadly. They were brutal. They were cruel. To give you an idea, Nineveh was their capital. So there's things that they did that there was a reason Jonah did not want to go. So if this is such a time of disobedience, then what is the purpose of this book? It was to show that God was committed to his covenant. He made through Moses, he made through Abraham, that he said, these things will happen, and even though all this other disobedience and all these whole things of lawlessness came about, he was still faithful to his covenant. And he will persevere to get them to the place where he wants them to be. He will nudge them, even if they're unwilling, to get to a certain point where then he can come in and have his kingdom set up. So when in every case, he rescued his people. So you have the sin, you have the oppressor of the country that came in, the cry out for help, and then to deliver. And the two stories at the end of Judges were to prepare you for the first king of Israel. So the main one was the tribe of Benjamin. So you had the Benjamin, there was a man in Benjamin, and it talks about that, they were like, everyone was doing was right in their own eyes. So there was this Levite that had come in with a concubine, and the tribe of Benjamin came and pretty much murdered her. They wickedly, raped her, murdered her. And so he wakes up, the Levite wakes up, didn't know that was happening in the middle of the night, and he sees that she's dead, and he gets upset. And so that's where he does this horrific, gruesome acts of cutting her up in 12 pieces, and he sends a piece to every tribe of Israel, and he says, we need to reunite and go against Benjamin for this gruesome act. Look how degrading they have become. Look how low they have become because of their lawlessness, and we need to rise up as a country and take them back and demand that they get back in line. So that whole practice was an Amorite practice, the whole cutting up and sending it out. That was an Amorite practice of a call to fight that the Levites, who did not have a relationship with God, took on. Well, the Amorites did it, and this must be the way to do it, and so that's why they did something so gruesome. And what happened is that the first time in the whole book of Judges, they actually come together against their own countrymen. And they come and they attack the Benjamites, and they almost eliminate all of them. It gets so bad that that's where it says that the Benjamins had to, the men had to sneak and grab the women, like in the nighttime, and take them back and say, you're going to be my wife now, because they had no one else left. Everyone had died. It got really, really bad. They were almost wiped out. But then after this whole story, you go into Samuel, and in 1 Samuel 8, the choosing of the first king Saul, who's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's from that tribe. So kingship was always an essential part of God's plan. The king is the servant. Remember I said he was the servant of the God of the day? So the king, after God's own heart, would have been his servant, would have been God's servant. And so he's sacred because he's serving the gods. And that's why when David came and said, I can't touch the man who the Lord has anointed, Saul, I can't kill him, because he is the chosen servant of our God Jehovah. It was very sacred. And so you have the Abrahamic covenant, which was the most important: land, descendants, blessing to all people, and kingship. Blessing to all people because Israel was chosen not to be the static country, but is meant to be dynamically influential into the whole world. And, when you get to Isaiah, he says, Israel, you're to be a light to the nations, a light to the nations. You're not to be able to be remaining of yourselves. And then kingship. He promised Abraham and his descendants that there will be someone from you that will rule over and have an everlasting kingdom. So that was the kingship. And the same thing whenever Moses was given a covenant called the Sinaitic covenant, land and descendants, he didn't say that a king would come from him, but he promised that a king would come that would bring Israel into the true promise that God had for them. And then you have the David covenant, the Davidic covenant, which says, I have chosen you, David, and in your line will become a king that will be on the throne forever. And Jesus fulfills all these covenants in what he did with his new covenant, but he is king. So when we call him Lord, if you will make him Lord of your life, you will be saved, about that being Lord. It is literally meaning making him king. So it's not just like, well, I'll serve you when I want, but I'm going to do something else. It's, you are my king, and what the king says goes, and you are serving him, and you are under his rule and his authority and his law, and you abide by that. So it's a whole different mindset, and it's hard for us, I know, as Americans, to think kingship, because I know that like history and everything that, they're taught at the schools, it's like, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. It's good to elect people, and it's important, and it is true. But that's not how God works. God has the kingship, and that's why Satan has to submit to it. It is all set up to be in a way that is good and divinely appointed. So then we have 1 Samuel. So 1 and 2 Samuel were originally one book, and then they were split whenever they had the Septuagint, the Greek Septuagint. They split it into two books, but in the Hebrew, it's just the one. Samuel is the author. It is a history book. Samuel is a type or foreshadow of Christ in that he's a prophet, a priest, and a ruler. And he's the only one that was able to have all three offices. So he served as a judge and protector between the time of the judges and the first king of Israel, Saul, and that he was also their priest between them and God, and a prophet of warning them of the things to come. Complacency towards sin turns triumphs into trials, but God promises to stay close if we invite him into our struggles and submit to his ways. That's one of the major themes of 1 and 2 Samuel, is that when you have all of these good things happening, you get complacent, and you don't necessarily invite the Lord to come in, and then sin can creep in and make you harden toward the God. But so then bad things happen. It turns into trials, and we think, why is this happening, Lord? And he's saying, I'm testing you, because there's importance in testing that we have to learn, just like I said, that it's not linear, that the Jews' history is circular, And so they had to learn testing so many times. So then when we have our walk and we think, why are we being tested? Don't you know? Like the same thing like where God would say to the Jews, did I not do these other things for you again and again and again? Why do you doubt me now? Why are you saying, oh, God can't do this? The same thing. God is tested again and again and again. So then why are trials happening now? Why, Lord? We should look at it in a different way. It's not linear, it's circular. Okay, so the book primarily focuses on Saul as the first king, David as the second king, and then the murderous intentions toward David by Saul. The monarchy is from 1050 BC to 931 BC. That is the only time it had a united monarchy, and then it becomes split, which I'll go into in a little while. But so 1 Samuel 1, it shows how Samuel becomes Israel's leader. The tabernacle is mentioned, unlike the book of Judges. Eli is the high priest. His 2 sons are corrupt, and Eli does nothing about it. They were actually having sexual relations with women at the tabernacle. So the holy place of the Lord, he was inviting people in, women in, and doing acts of sexual acts with them inside the tabernacle to say, I promise fertility if you do this. So that's what the pagans did. That was the Canaanite fertility practices, is that they would have the temples to their gods, and they would bring in the people or the king, especially with the high priestess of that tabernacle, and their union would promise, the gods would promise fertility to the land from that union. And so Israel thought, let's do that too, and they adopted that into God's holy sacred tabernacle. That's what he was doing. And saying, I promise fertility from this onto the land. Well, God was very angry with that. And so the first 3, chapters, the events are almost worse than the book of Judges. The tabernacle has been turned into a pagan temple that they are just flaunting. And so the Philistines, they come and they're being pressed against Israel. They're coming and attacking Israel. And the tribe of Benjamin. And so the Israelites are crying out. And so Eli's sons come up with this brilliant plan. They think it's brilliant. And they said, let's do this. So back in the ancient times, whenever the kingdom would go to war, this is pagan-wise practices, they would divide their groups of men into 3 people, and in front of it, they would have some sort of a statue of their god, or something that represented their god in front of each of the men. So they would go out with this figure, and then the army would be behind them, and it would be pretty much that the god's blessing that army to fight and to deliver the people. So Eli's sons say, let's do this with God's stuff. Okay, with our God's stuff. So what they did is they said, we're going to go against the Philistines, we're going to divide into 3 groups, and in front of each group, we're going to have the ark. And things from the tabernacle that we're going to present, because then that way that God is with us and he will deliver us, right? Because we're doing it the way that all the other countries are doing it. And so we're going to bring it out, our God, and show the Philistines, and we're going to win. So they do that. And they carried the ark as a statue of their God, and then the battle's lost. The sons are killed. Eli hears this, and he falls backwards. He hits his head, and he dies. He breaks his neck. And then the Philistines take the ark. They take it captive. So God doesn't need any man to help deliver himself. And so what happens is when they take the ark and they're like, oh, we did it. We defeated Israel. We took their sacred ark box back with us. And then all this stuff happens. Like they have this plague that breaks out and everyone's dying all left and right. And they're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And they know it's coming from the ark. And so they said, this must be a holy God. Send it back. And they just give it back to the Jews. They're like, take your ark back because we don't want it anymore. And so the Lord delivers himself by bringing it back to where it should be. And he takes care of Israel as their king. So this is all the background into Israel finally saying, we're tired of all these different leaders that are not doing what they're supposed to do. We just want a king. We just want someone we can follow, that we know is going to lead us into battle and lead us into victories, and we want structure. But the problem, this is why God looks at their request as sinful. It's not because they're asking for a king, because he said that. He told way back, remember I said 400 years ago, he said to Moses, they're going to ask for a king, and I will give them a king. So the whole request wasn't wrong, because he already said, I'm going to do it. But he said, I will choose the king. It's not going to be what they choose. So what they requested is give us a king like all the other nations. And God said, that's sinful. See, that's wrong. That's not what I want you to do. I want to pick the king that's after my own heart, not a king that is like all the other nations that you want, that is more pagan into their own hands, with paganism. So when the tribes, they all come together, they ask Samuel for a king. So Samuel is old at this point, and he had appointed his sons. He had 3 sons, and he made them judges over areas of Israel. Well, the sons did not walk greatly, it said, before the Lord, and they were corrupt. So Samuel is old, and he's about to die. He appoints these sons as judges, which he doesn't have a right to do so because he's not king. Okay? So that's odd that he did that. And his sons are corrupt. They're not even good kings. They're not even good judges. They're corrupt. They don't even want the Lord. So when people, they say, okay, so they see this. They see all this time up to this point, they've had no king. The people kept going into sin. Everything keeps going wrong. Eli's sons were so bad, and then they died, and then Eli died, so there's no more high priest. And then you have Samuel, who's getting old, who was a good ruler, but his sons are corrupt. He's about to die, and their sons are bad, and they're going to be our next judges. Just give us a king. We're tired of it. Just give us a king. And so Samuel's displeased. Did he see himself as a king? Why was he displeased? If he's about to die, why was he upset that they wanted to have a king? Because even God responds and says, they didn't reject you, Samuel. They rejected me as their king. So Samuel, he kind of looked at himself as king in order to appoint his sons, and so he was upset when they said, we don't want your sons. We want to have our own king. We want to give us a king like all the other countries. So Samuel gives the people a warning. He says there's 4 things that will happen if you have a king like all the other nations. 1 is that they will have a standing army of draftees, commoners, and professional warriors, which were aristocrats, meaning that he will take your sons to war if he wants to. So you don't want to go to war? Too bad. You have to do what the king says. Secondly, he would confiscate people's land and give it to his king's servant. So back in that time, the king owns all the land. So God owns the land, and that's why when he is their king, he gave them areas of land. This is for this tribe. This is for this tribe. This area of the promised land is for this tribe. He was allowed to do so because he was their king that delivered them into the promised land and was able to do that. But if you have an earthly king like all the other nations, then the king can just take people's land at will and say, I'm going to take your land and I'm going to give it to this person because this person I want to bless, and you don't have a say. The third thing is that he'll impose heavy taxes. And the fourth thing is that he'll force them to perform corvée labor. So corvée labor is, so most of the people at that time were farmers, and so you would work really, really hard, and then you would have this time of harvest, and after the harvest, it's kind of like a waiting time until the next time you would plant and plow. And so once they were done plowing and planting and working the ground, they would have about 4 months of the year where they're sitting back enjoying the harvest, and the king is allowed to come in at that time and say, okay, you have to do slave labor for me for free during that time, during that 4 months, you're going to work for me. And that was called corvée labor, and a king was allowed to do that. So God was saying, this is a king like all the other nations. This is what you're asking for. This is what will happen if you get a king like all the other nations and you don't submit to the person that I give you as king. So God gives them that warning, and you'll see why later on that's really important, I'll tell you. But kingship has always been a divine plan that God promised to Abraham, and it's very crucial because Jesus, the Messiah, is king. If kingship was wrong, he wouldn't have come as the king. He would have come as the elected a leader. So it is very, very important that we understand that. So I think we're done. We'll stop there before we get into Saul as the first king. But is there any questions about what I had talked about today? Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Yeah, Mary.
So I want to jump back to the tribe of Benjamin and what happened with the concubine. Like when I read that, I never, like I don't understand why the man was so upset because he gave the concubine to the Benjamites. Yeah, so like,
So,
then he cuts her up and says, you got to go after them.
yeah.
He caused it.
So I think, now it doesn't say this, but the fact that he did something like that, knowing that he pretty much said, he pretty much did something that caused an act of war. So he was there, he gave her to them, then they killed her, and he got upset, and he did something that a person would do when they, like a country would do to call out to the people, we're gonna go war against somebody. So it's almost like he set it up, where he went to that place knowing this was going to happen because he wanted to have the people retaliate against the Benjamites and destroy them. So he did, otherwise, he wouldn't have known to do the whole cutting up and sending it out, because that was an act of war that kingdoms did. So he did that right after that happened, which was very odd. If he was like, oh, I was taken away and I didn't realize, this is such a horrible thing for her. He had no, and it said that she ran away from him. The whole thing was that he was brutal to her. She ran away. He found her, dragged her back, took her to the place of the Benjamites, and then that's when that whole thing happened, and then he cuts her up and sends her out.
Wasn't that Judges 19, right? No?
It was, was it? Yeah.
Well, didn't they want a son first? They wanted a boy, right?
They won.
Wanted the man, the guy.
Yeah, and he
They
gave,
wanted the man.
yeah.
Which is even more messed
It's even. Everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. Yep. Anything else? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, going back to Rahab.
Yeah.
Okay, Rahab was a Gentile?
Yeah.
Okay. She is in Jesus's
Line.
genealogy. Okay. I could be wrong here, but I thought Jewish blood did pass through the mother.
It's true. That is true.
So I caught that right.
You did.
Okay. I don't know what that means.
So, Jewish blood passes through the mother when it comes to whether or not, but after so many generations of bringing it in, they're considered Jewish.
Okay.
So it later on ended up to be that way. But when it goes through but that line was talking about the line with David, which was kingly, and the kingship line went through the boy, not the girl. So she was in that line, but so that's why if you go to the New Testament and you see that there's two different gospels that give two different accounts of the line of Jesus, and you're like, well, because one of them is trying to prove a point that he was a king from the line of David, and the other one is trying to prove that he was Jewish, so from the tribe of Judah. And so that's why there's totally two different genealogies for Jesus, because one was following the woman, the other one was following the man. So the Rahab one that I showed you was technically the king line, because it went to David.
Thank you.
Yeah. But you're right.
When you said that, I was like, okay, that kind of screws up what I have always
Because Ruth
thought.
was also, she was Moabite. She was in there too. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Mary?
So was Boaz related to Naomi's husband? Why was he redeeming?
He was.
He was related.
Yes. It was a cousin. I don't know how close. But it wasn't like it was a brother or anything. Like it was farther out. But yeah, he was. He was the next closest relative. There was someone before him. But they denied that opportunity. Any other questions? Al?
Were judges like good guys, or I'm a little confused with it sounded like you said like the judges weren't godly. It sounded like they were pretty godly to me. Or why was there peace when each of the 12 judges ran?
So, I'll give you an example. Ehud, there was a Moabite king, Eglon. He was very, very fat. That's the story where he was on the throne. He was like, it talked about his rolls going off into the throne, and it was like really gross. But anyway, Ehud came in, he was left-handed, and so he snuck in because they checked his right hand, make sure there's no weapons. He didn't have one. And then he pulls out this dagger and stabs the king and kills him. Then he becomes the next leader of Israel. He wasn't this righteous judge that sat and judged Israel. He was a man that was able to sneak in and kill the king, and God used him with that and was able to give 80 years of peace to Israel because of him. He wasn't alive for those 80 years, but he brought that because the fact that he killed that Moabite king made all the other kingdoms scared of Israel, because they knew that all these random things were happening where God was delivering them. So they were more fearful of God than they were the leader. It wasn't necessarily always the leader. It was that God used him to bring peace. But was he necessarily godly? No. A lot of them weren't. They weren't judging like a Solomon that came and said, bring that case and that whole thing with the prostitute's baby and cut it in half, and he had all this wisdom, and he was a judge at that point. Or Samuel was an amazing judge, but the men that God used there, a lot of them weren't. They were just in the right time in the right place, and God used their act to bring peace to Israel, but they didn't actually do anything after that. It wasn't like they were leading, you know. Any other questions? Okay.
One note.
Yes.
Yeah, one note.
One note.
Samson in the Greek is Chuck Norris. Just saying.
Chuck Norris Samson. Well, thank you, and I hope I gave you a good, clear picture of what led up to kings of Israel. Pretty crazy. Chuck Norris. So does that mean that Chuck was a very prideful man that disobeyed God?
No.
Oh, not that part.